Peter Newell is a professor of international relations at the University of Sussex, and for nearly 25 years, he's conducted research on issues of climate change, agricultural biotechnology, corporate accountability, and trade policy, working in various parts of the world. His recent research has mainly focused on the political economy of low-carbon energy transitions, and he's undertaken research and policy work for many governments and international organisations. He's worked for non-government organisations ranging from Friends of the Earth to the Centre for Trade and Sustainable Development to the International Council on Human Rights Policy. He's a member of the board of the Brussels-based NGO Carbon Market Watch and the advisory board of the green think tank Greenhouse. He's also author and co-author of numerous books on environmental politics and co-founder of the Rapid Transition Alliance. He's also director of Greenpeace, and it's my privilege and honour to welcome Peter to this latest Brittain interview on behalf of Humanistically Speaking. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much.
Right, let me start by asking you what led you to become so involved with Greenpeace in particular. Was this a long-term plan of yours?
No, it wasn't a long-term plan. I mean, I'd worked with Greenpeace in different capacities over the years. As you mentioned in your introduction there, I worked at one point with Friends of the Earth while I was doing my PhD research. And then I worked for a group called Climate Network Europe in Brussels, which was doing the sort of climate campaigning for a number of leading NGOs, including Greenpeace. So that was another point at which I'd come across them. And I'd worked with them on various issues and campaigns. But it just so happened a few years ago, they were looking for a new director on the board, and a colleague of mine at Sussex, Andy Sterling, had previously been on the board, and they were wanting someone with specialism on environmental issues more broadly and a good sense of the UK environmental scene. And he recommended me, so I interviewed for the post and got it, and I'm very honoured, feel very privileged to be part of such a dynamic and important organisation.
Well, I don't think it's hard to find anything that's more important than the work that you're involved with now. But let me ask you a straight question. Is climate change reversible?
No. What we can do is try and mitigate some of the worst effects of it. So at the moment, we're on course, even in spite of, or perhaps because of the weaknesses of some of the national plans that governments have around the world, we're currently on course for sort of 3 to 4 degrees warming, which would be devastating. But the sooner we act and the sooner we can raise ambition on climate change and reduce emissions, because of course they're cumulative over time, the more we can reduce the very worst effects of climate change. So we have to live with climate change. A lot of what we're doing at the moment is about adapting to the effect of climate change. And of course, that's one of the key issues at the Glasgow summit this year. Yeah. Poorer countries in particular wanting more funds to adapt to the impacts of climate change, which they're already living with. I mean, all of us around the world are increasingly seeing the signs of climate chaos and having to live with it. But of course, it affects poorer and more vulnerable populations the most. And of course, they're the ones that have contributed to it the least. So that's the big social injustice at the heart of all of this.
It's becoming ever clearer, isn't it? I mean, particularly this year, it's been disaster after disaster, climate-wise. Yes. But can I just ask you just a basic background question? What exactly is meant by the term carbon footprint or carbon neutral? What do those terms actually mean? Start with carbon.
Yeah, there's different stories around the origin of the term carbon footprint. Some people attribute it actually to the oil company BP. They first started using the term, and they've been talking about that quite a lot in some of their communications recently, so saying what can we all do individually to try and tackle the climate crisis. Now on the positive side, that's about getting us all to think about how we can meaningfully make a contribution, because of course the issue often feels very overwhelming and there's not so much we can do. But there are things individuals can do, and we can explore that if you like. The cynical side suggests that companies like BP are trying to push the blame back onto us as households and individuals and consumers, and deflect away from the fact that they're still searching and extracting new oil, which is obviously actively contributing to the climate crisis. But that's the origins, that sort of notion that we need to think about how we can quantify our own individual contribution to this problem and therefore address it. And you'll have seen at the moment there's numerous apps and calculators to help you calculate your carbon footprint. No, a lot of it's around things like your house, emissions from leaky lofts and poorly insulated windows and things like that. But of course, it also covers transport and diet and a whole range of things. So it's trying to give you an overall holistic picture of your carbon footprint, how much carbon you emit from your day-to-day activities, and therefore what you can then do about it to try and reduce it.
It's interesting you mentioned cars and travel then, because I live in Basingstoke and we moved to this particular location because it had a good bus service. But within 2 years of moving here, the bus service was closed down. Yeah. So now we have to use a car.
Exactly.
Which seems to be appalling when we're all talking about climate footprint and being careful with emissions.
No, and that's the key thing, because it really is about infrastructures that enable you to do the right thing. I mean, that's the limit of carbon footprints and individualizing responsibility, because it assumes you and I have meaningful choices about how we get about, and actually we often don't. So really then it is about councils and governments and others providing meaningful and affordable low carbon alternatives.
On the international scale, though, what's your view of the idea that high-emitting wealthy countries might pay poorer, low-emission countries to offset their climate obligations? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I do. I think there's a definite need for funding from richer countries to poorer countries for adaptation and to enable them to, adopt lower carbon energy paths and all those sorts of things. But as an offset mechanism, as in paying for emissions reductions to take place elsewhere, I think that's problematic. It's basically, we have two types of carbon markets at the moment. There are voluntary carbon markets. So if you feel bad about your flights or car travel, you can buy these voluntary carbon offsets. And they'll end up paying for forestry projects or cook stove projects in some cases around the world, for example. And then there's a big UN clean development mechanism which does that on a much bigger scale. But the problem is, essentially, it's displacing the problem, in my view. I mean, there's lots of problems around how you account for how many emissions are really saved, and there's lots of double accounting and fraud, basically multiple selling of credits for the same emissions. But it's also taking the pressure off you and I, or people in the richer part of the world, to reduce those emissions at source, because you're buying your way out of trouble. You're saying, rather than us not expand Heathrow Airport or not go for HS2 or whatever it might be, we can press ahead with those things. We'll just pay people in India to protect their forests or to go for low carbon cook stoves or whatever it might be. So there's lots of problems around the technicalities of it in the calculation, but for me, it's also approaching the problem in the wrong way. So it's not to say don't give funding for those interventions in poorer countries, but let's not link it to you or I or richer countries having to do less, would be my argument.
I'll come back to the wealth issues of those that are wealthy are able to get away with climate emissions later. But at the risk of stating the obvious, what in your opinion are the most climate destructive industries in terms of their overall effect on the planet? Is it the oil industry?
There are several, unfortunately. I mean, of course, the fossil fuel industry is a key part of this. The largest contributor to carbon emissions is obviously the fossil fuel sector. So, oil, coal and gas are crucial to this. There are then, though, a whole series of other very energy-intensive sectors like chemicals, cement, steel. These sorts of things are a big part of the picture. Agriculture is also an increasingly important sector. And that, of course, then is linked to deforestation, which is another key driver of climate change, the destruction and release of carbon from burning of forests. But yeah, agriculture increasingly is under the spotlight. That's an increasingly important area, and meat and livestock production is one key area of that. So yeah, those are the sort of the largest emitting sectors, and some of the most difficult ones to change, actually, particularly things like cement and steel production, so on, where there's not that many alternatives really in terms of how you can produce those things in lower carbon or less energy intensive ways.
You mentioned agriculture.
Yeah.
I mean, we all know about the I suppose the farting cattle and all that kind of thing, but and the logging and destruction of the wildlife. Is that purely what you're thinking of, or are there any other aspects of agriculture that you find is dangerous?
Yeah, I mean, emissions are associated with all aspects of agriculture, but there are questions obviously of scale, and then there are, as environmentalists often talk about, there's luxury emissions and survival emissions. So methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, and that's emitted from rice production, for example, in paddy fields and so on. But we're not really in a position to say to growers in Cambodia or Philippines or India that they should be cutting back on rice production. So the much bigger problem, I think, for me is industrial agriculture, and it's around meat and livestock production because of all the things that are associated with that. So it's about clearing a forest for rearing cattle, but it's also about soya production, which is largely used for cattle feed at the moment. So it's all of those aspects, and then of course it is the farting cows that you're talking about. So it's about the use of land. It's about also the water inputs are vast for meat and livestock industries. But for me, it's about the scale. It's not that those activities in and of themselves, like producing meat or producing rice or whatever it might be, are inherently destructive. But the way we're currently doing, or the scale at which we're doing it through large factory farms and industrial agriculture and so on, is incredibly destructive. And of course, it's also to do with shifting dietary preferences, in China and other larger countries where extensive meat eating wasn't quite so popular before, and now it is increasingly, or increasing uptake of dairy products and so on. So that's also a driver of those things and those increased emissions in that sector.
Of course, there's another side to this as well, because the more land that's taken over by farming to feed the world, there's less space for wildlife, which as someone from Greenpeace you would care about very much, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's another part of it. And of course, everyone's talking about rewilding and restoration and so on, freeing up land as carbon sinks, basically. People are talking a lot about nature-based solutions and that side of things. So if we're going to protect land for that, then it runs up against some of those other demands. Yeah. Just as it does with biofuels and other pressures, the more you try and sort of use land-based solutions for mitigation, it runs up against those sorts of challenges.
Does anyone really have any idea what the outcome might be by the end of the century if we do nothing? I know there have been studies about this, but the latest information I've seen suggests that the outcome could well be worse.
It'll be a lot worse, yeah. No, I mean, if you look at all the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change models about scenario.
Hello, we've been blocked.
The governments act on all the promises that are written into their plans under the Paris Agreement. So that's a big if as well. Can you still hear me?
I can now, yes.
Okay, did I break up? Sorry. If not, I can set off my camera. So yeah, and if you look at what that means in reality, 3 to 4 degrees warming, I mean, it's devastating in terms of impacts on humans and wildlife and broader environments, because what you get are what are ironically named positive feedback effects, where as the ice melts, sea level rises, the less ice you have, there's reduced ability to reflect sun back into the sky, and so more ice melts, you get more sea level rise. Or as forests dry out because of warming, they're more likely to burn, releasing CO2 back into the atmosphere. So all of these things start to reinforce one another in a very negative way. So it's those feedback effects, which is what most people are really worried about, these sort of key tipping points, which we're accelerating towards, unfortunately.
Well, I imagine with the melting of the ice cap, it may accelerate as the ice cap gets smaller, I suppose.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Glass and gin and tonic. So we're having this conference, this gathering in Glasgow in a couple of months' time. Do you wonder, though, whether even now world governments are taking climate change as seriously as they need to?
I mean, they're clearly not. Some of the rhetoric has changed and the language has changed, and many governments have declared a climate emergency, and some are upping the ambition. We've seen this in the EU and China and the US, starting to move in the right direction, but clearly it's not at the speed or scale that's required. And what you're also finding, of course, is quite a few contradictory policies, as we're seeing also closer to home in the UK, where there's still talk about opening up, new oil reserves in the North Sea, or talk even of a new coal mine in Cumbria and these sorts of things, or expanding Heathrow Airport. at the very time we're under the spotlight to show climate leadership and to try and persuade China and India and others to go further. And it's obviously a lot harder to do that if you've not got your own house in order. So the rhetoric is getting there, and there is some progress being made. Some good policies are being put in place. Ambition is slowly ratcheting up, but there's a lot of undermining and contradictory policies which undermine the overall effect of those things, and that's what's worrying.
I think you've anticipated my next question, because I was going to say, I mean, my own feeling is that we get a lot of lip service from governments about limiting climate change, but there are inconsistencies, as you said. I mean, even with the UK, the government proudly proclaims credit for wind farms, whilst at the same time announcing trade deals for Australian lamb, South American beef and chicken from the USA, all of which we get from Europe.
Yeah,
it just seems precisely so inconsistent to me.
It is, and there was a story that broke today. I don't know if you saw it, saying that in the negotiations over the trade deal with Australia, the UK government caved in and removed some of the language about the Paris targets. So although there's discussion still about this will be compatible with our climate targets, in reality, the sort of mention of the bold temperature limits and targets was all removed to try and pacify the Australian negotiators, and that tells you quite a lot, really, about priorities.
I saw that story too, and if it's true, I think it's absolutely disgraceful. Absolutely disgraceful. It shows a level of hypocrisy, but no doubt we'll come back to that later. Now, you're reported to have quoted a recent analysis that shows that responsibility for finding a solution to endless global warming is not an even one, and that the wealthy, who are by far the biggest contributors, need to take the biggest constraints. Now, you said, for example, whilst emissions from the poorest 50% in the EU fell by 24% between 1990 and 2015, carbon emissions from the most affluent 10% actually grew by 3%. And for the wealthiest, the super rich, it grew by 5%. That seems just incredible to me. I mean,
it is.
Since the wealthy also have the greatest political clout, how are we going to persuade these, frankly, powerful people to cut their emissions? That seems to be a deep problem to me.
It's a huge problem, and of course, we need a range of approaches to trying to deal with that, a mix of carrots and sticks and so on. Some of it might be through persuasion and so on, but I think in some instances we're a bit beyond that. I think we do need things like frequent flyer taxes. I mean, my own preference would go a lot further than that. And one of the things we said in that report, which was the Cambridge Sustainability Commission on Scaling Behaviour Change, was the need for what we call choice editing, which really means stopping really destructive products and services coming to market in the first place. Can we, in a moment like this of climate emergency, afford for richer people to have multiple private jets, for example? My answer would be no. In terms of government steering of tax breaks, innovation, industrial policy, can we not send a strong steer out that the sorts of products and services we need now are the low carbon ones? And can we stop making those sorts of products which are incredibly, it's for the absolute elites, the huge yachts, the private jets and all the rest of it. So there's an element of restricting destructive products coming to the market in the first place. But I think there's a role for taxation, there's a role for regulation, lots of different things to try and tackle this. But yes, what we refer to as the polluter elite in that report describes sort of three different dimensions of their power. One is the lifestyles, which is the things we're talking about now. The second is the financial power that those actors have, where they store their stocks and shares and all of that, much of which is still based in the fossil fuel economy. But also their political power. A lot of them make huge donations to political parties and philanthropic foundations and so on. And so if they chose to do so, they could make a huge difference in using that power in a more productive direction, to try and steer things in a more sustainable direction. So there's plenty that can be done. Some of it might be just through social pressure and a sense in which it's no longer okay to do those things. But I do also think we need levers of state power in terms of taxation and regulation and so on, because otherwise it's really hard to persuade anyone else to act on this issue. If the very richest and those most responsible are not playing ball, basically, or committing their fair share, it's very, very hard to persuade the rest of us that we need to take the bus when you see a line of SUVs queued up outside the school in the morning. It's something which I experience. That is that type of issue. The sense that we're in it together requires those who emit most to act first, basically.
I like your idea about legislation. I mean, I know in this country, I suppose particularly with this government, I don't particularly like the idea of legislation. But it's interesting that when the supermarket chains are criticised for their packaging or whatever that's not green, very often the feedback I get is that they're quite happy to change, but they prefer if the government came out with some sort of legislation that applied to all of the supermarkets. Exactly. Now, that seems perfectly reasonable to me.
It does, yeah.
I don't know why the government doesn't do that. This is actually helping the supermarkets to be able to behave, sensibly.
No, I hear that quite a lot from. I hear that quite a lot from businesses. Some of whom want to go further, but they're worried about losing a competitive advantage or being undercut by their rivals. And so, as you say, the logic of that is to say this should be a minimum standard that applies to all of them. In other words, it's not okay to free ride on the efforts of other supermarkets or whoever the actors happen to be. It's not a legitimate way of getting a comparative advantage by cutting corners environmentally to make your products cheaper. And that is the job of governments to have common, harmonious, standardised regulation.
In the meantime, I still don't understand why it's cheaper to buy potatoes from Tesco's wrapped in plastic than it is to buy them loose. And I've complained about that, and they've come up with some eyewash about it's easier to handle them or something like that. I don't know. Anyway, but this is a fundamental thing for me, because my fear is that we seem to be locked into an economy that seems to be founded on ongoing and ever-increasing consumption of our planet's resources. And that system was established, it goes back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but it seems unstoppable. I don't know how on earth governments, even with the best will in the world, are going to turn this around and stop this plundering to adopt a more climate-friendly culture. I mean, that really is, to me, that's the nub of the problem. This endless consumption must stop, and perhaps even we might have to lower our standard of living. That's one to take, isn't it?
It's a huge challenge and a huge issue, and one that governments routinely shy away from because they realise electorally it plays. It's a difficult one to raise. Can we live differently? I guess the key thing is to shift the conversation from just being about more and more growth all the time. Because growth in sorry,
that's all right.
It's my wife shouting next door. The kids are back from school.
Don't we all?
It's a huge issue. Our economies are hardwired in very unsustainable ways to, as you say, to produce and consume more. And what's not reflected in growth figures is all the costs that are passed on to society and to the environment. So at the moment, if more and more people, if there are more car accidents, if there are more people taking antidepressants, that all counts as economic activity. All of these things are throughput in the economy, and that all counts. And obviously at human level, those are negative things. Those are showing that the economy is malfunctioning, that we're moving in the wrong direction. So firstly, we obviously need new indicators of growth and things that account for progress and well-being and all of those sorts of things. And I think once you start to have that conversation, it becomes a bit easier to say, do we need to consume at this level to improve our well-being? You might know about the work on the spirit level from it's Wilkinson and what was the other person? Anyway, there's a famous book called The Spirit Level. And basically that work and other work shows that beyond a certain level of income, people tend not to get happier. In other words, there's a certain basic level that we all require in order to live fulfilling and happy lives.
Oh yes, this is I learned this in management training. Yes, it's you can get so far. Extra income can make you happy, but when you get to a certain point, it makes no difference at all.
Exactly. Yeah. So having those sorts of conversations about what's really, really needed are vital, and that's where we start to shift those things, because it's fairly clear that consuming and producing more and more isn't making people happy. You can see that quite clearly in terms of, and inequality is one of the crucial things. That's what that work on the spirit level really shows, that countries where there's very, very high levels of inequality often perform poorly across a whole range of health and other indicators around crime and lack of social cohesion. These things are often quite related. So for me, that's the starting point to say, how do we live more fulfilling, happier, more prosperous lives? And that's not the same thing as just going for conventional growth and producing and consuming ever more, because that is depleting the quality of our life in lots of ways. So there's a big challenge to sort of force that conversation, but it is coming. There are commissions on happiness. Even David Cameron started talking about it in this country, didn't he, some years ago? Bhutan has gross. Yeah, well, he talks about that as well. But in Bhutan, there was the gross national happiness indicators. There's a bit of the Happy Planet Index that the New Economics Foundation has. There's various attempts to try and sort of measure progress in more meaningful ways that capture actually whether we are happier and healthier as societies, because the current approaches just clearly don't do that, and they're unsustainable.
I mean, the happiness objective is actually very, very humanist. The object in life is to be as happy as you can possibly manage it, not wealthy. It doesn't bring you those things. But anyway, that's perhaps another issue.
No, but it is a big issue, and it's also, you can't, you're not entitled, and none of us is entitled really to achieve such a level of wealth that it undermines other people's ability even to live. It's a bit like the Gandhian quote: "We have to live differently so that others may simply live." It really is about that. In a world of finite carbon budgets, if we're going to allow others to increase their carbon, footprint, as they necessarily must, to live meaningful lives, others of us have to cut back to accommodate that, and that's the global responsibility we face.
Okay, you said that the British government is actually, or you're quoted as saying, the British government is actually bailing out Britain's biggest polluters by granting tax credits to major oil and gas firms and slashing taxes on domestic flights within the UK. You kind of alluded to that at the beginning of this interview. But I mean, do you detect a change of heart in the government now, or do you think the British government is being duplicitous? I don't want to get you into any problems here, but
no, that's fine. I mean, I think it's hard to often say what does the government think, because what you find is different ministries and different individuals have different opinions on this, so they're working this out internally. So I work quite a lot with BEIS, the Department of Energy and Industrial Strategy. And of course, they're pushing for quite ambitious action, and DEFRA and other parts of government working more on the environmental side, or the development part of now FCDO, formerly DFID. They're quite keen on bolder climate action, but it runs up against problems with other parts of FCDO or the Treasury, who have a very different take on how much is all of this going to cost and what does it mean for the competitiveness of UK PLC. So I think there's differences across government departments about how far and how fast to go, for sure. I think the UK recognises, particularly in this year when the spotlight is on the UK, that they have to do more, and that we have a peculiar and particular responsibility, being the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, and there's a historical responsibility as a former colonial power and so on, to lead on this issue, and to take more responsibility. And of course, being the home to the City of London, which financially punches above its weight and has a big financial reach and power, we shoulder extra responsibilities, I think. So the UK definitely feels all that, and I think there are individuals within government that get this agenda and want to move forward on it, but there's plenty of people in the Conservative Party that are very much opposed to any new regulation, not too keen on taxation either, not wildly keen on forms of international cooperation, particularly within the EU, of course, but more broadly. And that then narrows the range of options that are available to you. And at the same time, they are quite close to a lot of powerful business groups. And hence the point about the subsidies and the tax breaks and all of that. So for me, it's, ultimately one of the key issues is the misallocation of finance. If you take the case of fossil fuel subsidies, it's $10 million a minute. $10 million every single minute spent by governments subsidising fossil fuels around the world. Now imagine if we were to redirect that towards supporting renewable energy for poorer communities or for communities around the world. It could make such a huge difference. So it's about making the tough and the bold choices, about moving money in different directions. And, you know, for the Conservative Party and other actors, that might mean standing up to some of your powerful donors and saying, you know, you've had your time, you've made huge amounts of money, but we need to move on now. We need a different economic model that's more sustainable for all our sakes.
Can I just underline that? You said 10 million in subsidies every minute. Did you say?
So this is globally. This is not
globally,
the UK.
yeah,
Globally, yeah. 10 million US dollars a minute on fossil fuel subsidies. That's an IMF figure, International Monetary Fund figure.
Good grief.
Yeah. So this is, you know, this is what you're up against, and there's a reason those subsidies are in place. There's lots of very powerful actors, you know, making party contributions and lobbying for those sorts of things. So it's very hard to dismantle those things, but you know, clearly that's what needs to happen.
Your point about the Industrial Revolution, I thought was well made. I mean, the Industrial Revolution did start here. And there's a side of me that thinks, well, here we are, we're an advanced country, thanks to the Industrial Revolution to a large extent. And there are other countries in the world who look at what we've got, and it's not, it's understandable, isn't it, that they want the same kind of wealth, the same kind of luxury that we have. And we are saying to them, no, you can't do that. You know, we're now in a situation of climate change that people like us have actually caused. And we're asking developing nations to restrict and contain themselves. And that seems to me a bit, well, not the right way of thinking things. I mean, one thing that strikes me in particular is that the Americans have been accusing the Chinese of being the worst polluters in the world. I think they are. But the Chinese have gone back to the Americans and said, well, per capita, given the size of our population, the size of your population, your individuals consume twice as much as we do.
Yeah.
So why are you complaining about us? The Americans have got to play their part. And those sorts of differences worry me in the sense that it's not encouraging if we're looking for a worldwide solution. And we are looking for a worldwide solution. The British alone can't do it, neither can the Americans. It has to be an agreement by the world. And I think we have to be open-minded about developing countries that want a piece of the cake, a piece of the act.
Of course, yeah. So it goes back to what we were saying before. Some of it's around historical responsibility because these emissions are cumulative, and that does mean US and UK and Japan and many others have to, you know, take the lion's share of responsibility for this. But it is also the fact that China is now the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. But it's also correct what China says, that if you do it on a per capita basis, then China and India drop right down the rankings, and countries like Australia and Canada and others go right up, as does the US. And that is a big issue because there are, you know, huge inequalities in emissions within those countries. Some of it's just down to the size and scale of the countries. And so, I mean, this is what the global negotiations are basically trying to deal with. How do you address those sorts of issues around who moves first? And of course, under the Paris Agreement, all countries have to come forward with what are called these nationally determined contributions. And actually, you know, some of the key drivers in places like China and India, it's not just concern about climate change. In fact, in some cases, that's not the primary driver. It's more things like energy security. So in India, the country still imports huge amounts of oil. So one way of trying to reduce state expenditure and become more energy independent is to move away from that. So they have a whole drive. They have this solar mission and a big push on renewable energy. Likewise, you know, production of solar energy in China is huge, and wind energy. So they're moving onto renewables, not necessarily for concerns about climate change, but around competitive advantage. And those are the key, you know, or energy security. Those are the sorts of things that are driving change in those contexts. Likewise, to some extent in the US, even when the US was, you know, pulling out of the Kyoto Protocol and not keen to engage, or when President Trump said, you know, we're not going to sign up to the Paris Agreement. I'm going to put Pennsylvania before Paris. And then the governor of Pennsylvania stood up and said, well, we want to sign up to Paris because we don't want to be left out of the, you know, the shift towards renewable energy. There's many actors and businesses and states, even individual states within the US, that will want to move faster on this. So I think that's the key challenge. Often it's going a bit below the national level, because often around cities and businesses and NGOs and others, there is actually a lot of movement, a lot of initiatives. Some of the momentum, in other words, is from below, but that doesn't do away with the need to arrive at a global settlement which is fair in terms of who moves furthest and fastest. So some of these issues, I mean, they've been there all the way through the negotiations. Initially, China and India would say, no, you move first. And that was, that was understandable. Over time, their emissions increasing means that they now have to be at the table and reduce their emissions, and they have reasons to do that. But they receive aid and technology transfer and all of these things, and the UN has mechanisms for their commitments being conditional on the receipt of those things. So that's one of the ways in which you get around some of those problems. We will decarbonise, but we need some support in doing that. That's a sort of fairer way of doing it. Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I was reflecting on your comment about, the second layer of government. The local governments seem to be doing more than the national governments. And I felt that in certain states in America, in California, for example, I think there's much more awareness to climate change than there is at the highest level, certainly in the Trump era. Although I don't particularly like talking about Mr. Trump. But my next question actually was, before we go on to that, would you say that was a worldwide thing? I mean, I'm only aware of the USA, but are there other countries where you think that it's the middle level that's working harder than the national?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of initiatives like C40 there's 40 of the largest cities around the world that have declared climate targets and commitments, and a lot of cooperation around both mitigation as sort of cities as emitters and contributors to the problem, but also in the front line of adaptation to climate change. So a lot of collaboration and target setting and that sort of thing. So, in China and Shanghai and other places are moving quite fast on this. In India, I know many state levels have far more ambitious climate targets and plans than the national level government. So I do think that that is a worldwide phenomena. And likewise in this country, some local councils have declared climate emergencies and pushing further and faster than others. So getting that momentum going from below, I think, is absolutely crucial. And actually, even at the international level, that's increasingly organised. They have this non-state climate action zone where they actually now try and record and capture the emissions reductions being achieved by all these different initiatives by business and cities and civil society, because that's a crucial, governments can only do so much. They set the framework, they set the regulation, there's certain things they can control. But of course, in a more neoliberal, privatised economy, a lot of these things they don't control. They've either outsourced it, local governments are dealing with it, or businesses are the key actors. And so they need to change their behaviours.
Well, actually, that's a real cause of hope and a real positive message. And I think that's something, a source of inspiration, because I didn't know that, and I don't know if many other people know that. Now, I was going to ask you, what countries would you say are the worst performers and which are the best? But given what you've just told me, I think that's pretty impossible. Because it depends on how long's a piece of string. There's so many variables. So I'll put that to one side, unless you've got any opinions on that.
Well, no, I think it very much depends on which aspects of the issue you're talking about. But some governments are taking bold leadership on this, and it's not just northern richer countries. So, for example, on agreements to leave fossil fuels in the ground, you have countries like Costa Rica, Belize, but also New Zealand, France, Denmark, making those sorts of commitments. So depending on the issue, you can find good examples of leadership. My wish is that you had more countries doing all of those things simultaneously. But that's what we're trying to move towards.
Well, hopefully the Congress in Glasgow will make a difference. I certainly hope so. Anyway, I'd like to briefly switch to matters of population, which I think I would say is relevant to the whole thing. Now, according to most estimates that I've seen, world population seems to be rising every year by just over 1%. Now, that may not sound much, but it's in the order of about 80 million new consumers every year. So how much does world population control play into preserving a clean and healthy environment? And where do you think the balance should lie between the individual right to have children and the needs of wider society?
Yeah, so this is a very tricky and controversial question, and there's a long history of this, which is why a lot of people prefer not to talk about population control. because of earlier concerns around this, like in the 1970s, all these books coming out on the population bomb and Paul Ehrlich and people like that. And what that led to in some instances was forced sterilizations in some parts of the developing world in particular, and all sorts of controversial interventions. So we need to be very, very careful. And I think the key thing is, of course, the way to manage population growth is more around having control over reproduction, right? I mean, reproductive choices and girls' education and dealing with those sorts of issues and availability of contraception and all those sorts of things, I think are really important. But, you know, going back to our previous conversation, consumption is really the sort of bigger part of the story. So in a way, it matters where the people are born. If we've got population growth in richer parts of the world, it's more of a problem than if it's in poorer parts of the world, because the carbon footprint over the life course of someone in the richer parts of the world is, you know, magnitudes of times larger than someone in a poorer part of the world. Mm-hmm. So if in the richer part of the world, population numbers were expanding, but I think in most cases they're not, that would be far more of a problem, because it's those people that will grow up owning larger homes, having multiple cars, flying frequently, etc., quite possibly. So I think, and also given the timescales in which we have to tackle this problem, you know, if we are going to try and keep anything like the right side of 2 degrees, let alone 1.5, it means acting now. And so that has to target the highest consuming people now. But I think there are good developmental reasons to support reproductive health and, you know, access to contraceptives and all those sorts of things across the world, really, and through girls' education and so on, because those seem to be the things that shift population trajectories. So I think it's an important part of the equation, but sometimes it's used to say, this is the key thing, and let's not talk about consumption, whereas I think we do need to talk about consumption.
I think that's a good point. I mean, I looked at the relative growth figures in the various parts of the world before I spoke to you, and I can see that Oceania, North America, and Europe, they're pretty level. They're not going up or down. They're just stable.
Yeah.
South America's is on the increase, and Africa's on a steep climb. But the biggest threat caused by, if you call it a threat, caused by increasing population seems to be in Asia.
Yeah.
And I do agree with you, absolutely. A lot of it is about education for women and girls. I think it's so important. Let's hope that resolves itself. But in Asia, it's going up dramatically. And of course, the Chinese did try, the communist government did try the single child family rule, and that led to worldwide condemnation, and eventually they couldn't sustain it. So
and a lot of deaths of young girls. So there was a lot of
that was yes, a cultural tragedy byproduct. Is there a limit to human population that the world can cope with, do you think? Or is that an appropriate question?
I'm not sure how you define that, because it depends on so many other things, doesn't it? It's really like, what level of resources is that population using, and can that be sustained? I mean, again, to quote Gandhi, there's more enough wealth in the world to meet everyone's needs, but not everyone's greed. In a way, that sort of basic truth and statement holds true still. It's really about managing greed. I think there are enough resources for the sort of levels of population we currently have, and possibly going forward. Clearly, will bring stresses and challenges and so on, but the bigger issues are around redistribution of wealth and about reducing, but also, of course, giving people access to contraception and avoiding, you know, family planning help based avoid.
What are you hoping for overall out of the forthcoming COP26 summit? What is the best outcome that you think is reasonable to expect?
So, well, those are two different questions. Best outcome, what's reasonable to expect? What I would hope for, I mean, basically we need more progress on the finance. This is what a lot of developing countries are saying, and they're really upping the ante on this at the moment, saying some of them might not even come and attend the negotiations unless there is more money on the table, like clearer commitments on adaptation and mitigation finance, because a lot of richer countries have not been delivering on their commitments, you know, that go back as far as the Copenhagen summit in 2009. So that's the key issue, sort of more money on the table and greater clarity about how that will be distributed. Another big issue is about the rules of carbon trading. So something called Article 6 under the Paris Agreement. I know business actors in particular, for some of the reasons we've already discussed, that if they're going to get anywhere near net zero, they want to be able to use offsets and carbon trading, and they're desperate to get rules fixed on that. My hope as a sort of environmental activist is that those rules are quite tightly constrained so that there's not fewer loopholes for the abuse and misuse of those offsets, and that they take much more seriously the sustainable development benefits of those projects. It's not just about reducing the carbon, that it actually brings genuine benefits to communities that are expected to host these projects. And then there will be things around what's called loss and damage. So this is poorer countries wanting to know whether they will get compensation, basically, for the fact that, you know, some of the places they live are no longer viable, frankly, and the agricultural systems that they depend on are no longer viable in a warming world. So there are big and very contentious issues around loss and damage. So some progress on that, I think, would be crucial, but that's going to be very difficult. I think you will see some progress on finance. You might see some progress on carbon trading, but the really big issues like loss and damage, rich countries are fighting tooth and nail not to discuss those things, because of course it opens that can of worms about their accountability and historical responsibility, and they don't want to go there. But what always happens at these negotiations, there will have to be some deal brokering across these different areas. You know, if you concede more on this issue, we'll concede more on that area. And so developing countries may say that they will settle for less money on the table in one area, but they want more funds in another area. Or for them to sign off on more carbon trading, they want more money for adaptation financing or something like that. This is the way it tends to work. There's that sort of horse trading, basically, across these different issue areas. But what I would also really like to see, and there's more and more momentum behind this, is, you know, clearer agreements to try and fairly leave remaining fossil fuels in the ground. Now, that's clearly not going to come out of this summit, but some strong signalling on it. So we've already got a Powering Past Coal Alliance, and the UK is part of that. There's now an emergent formation of a Beyond Oil and Gas coalition, which involves countries like Costa Rica and Denmark and others. And it would be great if the UK could show some real leadership in saying, you know, we want to be part of those efforts, because that's ultimately gets to the source of the problem. You know, the Paris Agreement doesn't even mention fossil fuels at the moment, whereas, as we discussed before, that's the largest contributor to climate change. So it's a nonsense, really. We have to have some clear multilateral framework for phasing those out. And I've been involved in this campaign for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, modelled a little bit on the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, which is really about that. It's about, you know, fairly phasing out remaining fossil fuels, obviously allowing poorer countries to expand their use where necessary for meeting developmental needs, but requiring richer countries to phase them out more quickly.
When we have these agreements, supposing we did have a fossil fuel, keeping fossil fuel in the ground agreement, there must be some sort of inspection procedure to make sure that countries are keeping their word.
Yeah.
Does that go to the United Nations?
So there are countries have to report on this, and there is scope for NGOs and others to highlight discrepancies and inconsistencies and non-compliance. Because governments obviously put their best foot forward in these reports. They might not, you know, mention the other decisions that they're simultaneously making to expand roads or airports or other things, or they may not report the amount of tax breaks and subsidies that we've been talking about. And so that falls on activists and others to highlight those things and share that information with the UN Secretariat, so they have a more informed picture. But yes, if you were to have a fossil fuel treaty, there would have to be, and there's been discussions about this already, a global registry. And with something like that, it would be a bit easier with GIS and satellite and so on to monitor who's leaving what reserves in the ground. That shouldn't be too hard to actually observe and enforce. The more difficult question, in a way, is the sanctions. What do you do if a country just blatantly ignores those sorts of things? And obviously, there's limited things you can do through international law, or countries are often reluctant to use sanctions and other things against one another, because they know full well that they might break those rules themselves at one point. So that's a difficult challenge. But yeah, all treaties have to deal with this, the question of compliance.
So, would I be right in saying that, in your opinion, the single most urgent action that governments must take is to reach agreements to keep fossil fuel in the ground, or is there
Yeah,
another more urgent issue?
I mean, all of them are urgent in different ways, but for me, that's the largest, driver of the problem, and yet we're just clearly not adequately addressing it. So I think it has to be addressed. I mean, the more you get these sort of club arrangements, as they're called, the beyond oil and gas or the powering past coal, these sorts of things, the better. That's sort of building the scaffolding for something else, because obviously a new treaty will take a while to negotiate, and time is not on our side. But having these other arrangements that sort of do the groundwork, if you like, of a new treaty, I think are really, really important. But also, the social pressure, that's not something we've discussed much so far, but the social movements, the movements to keep these reserves in the ground, Indigenous peoples groups, increasingly mobilising against particular projects. We've seen these big pipeline projects in the US get cancelled because of this. These sorts of things are trying to sort of put a line in the sand and say, okay, enough of this, we just can't carry on this pathway. And that then feeds into investors' perceptions about risks and what they can get away with. And that, for me, emboldens governments to go a bit further, because they realise, there's actually a public appetite, and there's social opposition to this. And that is a game changer, I think.
See, what's come over to me in this whole interview really is that it's the grassroots that seem to be sticking their toes in. And getting involved in stopping government. And as I say, one of the questions, my last question I was going to ask you was, how can ordinary people best play their part? Well, I think you've pretty much explained that, haven't you?
I think, just to sort of sum it up, I guess there's various ways, both as individuals in our households, our decisions about consumption day to day, that can make a difference, but also us as citizens, when we go to work, in the workplace, there are things that can be done. Workplace travel schemes, decisions about how your work buildings are heated, all of those sorts of things. But then us as citizens, how we participate in broader public life through NGOs or, religious movements, social civic life more generally. There's numerous ways in which we intervene politically in a sort of small p way and a big p way that all make a difference. Constantly haranguing your MPs and engaging in protests and all those sorts of things is hugely important. But using your purchasing power is important. And also it's about values, isn't it? It's about how we treat one another, the sort of compassion that we show and the care that we show for one another. And what we consider to be important. If we do prioritise, clean air and well-being and safe and secure communities and resilient food systems and all these things, that's all climate action in my book. It doesn't often get described that way, but it really is. And so there's actually...
I was just going to say, what do you think about Extinction Rebellion? Are they brave eco-warriors or ignorant extremists? What are they?
I'd say their contribution has been really important. I don't think we would have had climate emergencies being declared by local councils, let alone national government, without the action they've taken. And they clearly, because of the numbers of people involved and people willing to get arrested for the cause, they've really tapped into something. And there's a lesson there for Greenpeace and many other organisations that, all our years of advocacy and strategy and campaigning have only gone so far, that there is an appetite to go further. And partly, I think, people want that sense of, what can I do? They're reading the news and they're seeing the climate disasters all the time, and things are just not changing. And so one thing you could do is very physically put yourself out there and say, enough is enough. I'm holding, bearing witness, really. Yeah. I'm holding this institution, this bank, this parliament to account for what you're not doing in my name. And I won't tolerate the impacts. And I think that's quite a powerful thing to do. And it, of course, it generates media attention and debates. Of course, it always produces backlash, and people don't like the inconvenience. They don't like any attempts to seek attention. But really, when other channels are failing, and the system is stitched up in lots of other ways, I think it's understandable and it's right that people use their voice as citizens to make their voice heard any way they can. So I would never endorse, violent actions, but I think peaceful, direct action is definitely one of the things we need to be doing.
Even if it causes great inconvenience?
Well, it's a short-term inconvenience for some people, and I regret that. But compared with the disruption and the inconvenience of climate chaos that's coming our way, that's already here, frankly, doesn't really compare. So if it does solicit actions, if it does raise awareness, if it sort of gets us moving in the right direction, I think those sorts of things are justifiable. I mean, if you look at any big cause against apartheid or the suffragette movement or battles against racism, colonialism, any of these things, of course, they're inconvenient for some of the groups in power. They cause disruption, they make noise, property sometimes gets damaged, but you probably wouldn't look back and say they shouldn't have done that. And really those movements only thrive if there's some moral legitimacy, if enough people think that what they're doing is okay and justifiable, and if they don't, they'll stop joining them, and they certainly won't be putting their bodies on the line, and then it disappears, and that gives you a sort of a check of whether they're in line with the public mood. So that let's see what happens. But I think of course, there's some questions around some of the tactics and strategies that have been adopted, but overall, I think their influence has been a positive one.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I mean, it's been an inspiring interview, and I'll play this over and over again, and I'll probably learn something new every time. But before we close, are there any messages that you want to get out to the humanists? I mean, humanists be watching this all over the country. Is there anything else? Anything I haven't covered that you'd like to raise?
Well, all I would say, and this is more in my role with part of something called the Rapid Transition Alliance, and our strapline is Evidence-Based Hope. So if you haven't heard of us, have a look at our website, because we have lots of positive can-do stories of change around all sectors: energy, transport, food, housing, water, and from around the world, and historical examples as well, which is really just saying positive change is happening and has happened before. And we need to learn from it and share it. And it's also then an advocacy tool for calling out inaction. So when governments say we couldn't possibly, decarbonise our transport system, or people would never accept pedestrianisation, you can say, well, it has happened in Bogota, it has happened in Barcelona, so why not in Brighton or London or wherever? Or when they say we couldn't possibly, manage water in that way, we say, well, they've done it in Chennai, in Mumbai, they've done it in, do you see what I mean? So it's showing examples which people then use to campaign and say, well, why not? Because actually it's already been done, or it is happening, or it has happened before in these places. So that I would encourage people to sort of use some of those positive stories and other things they're hearing about to push their own communities, politicians and others to say, why not? Why can't we do these things? Because they're already out there.
This is called Evidence-Based Hope, is that?
So the alliance is called the Rapid Transition Alliance.
Our Rapid Transition Alliance, yeah.
And our strap line, our sort of, calling card, if you like, is Evidence-Based Hope in a Warming World. So it's really, we try to showcase, and we do sort of almost weekly stories about the possibility of rapid and progressive change. And we have about 100 civil society organisations worldwide that are part of this. And it's really that, generating stories of hope and the possibility of change to show that, we can do this. Clearly there's massive challenges around doing it at scale and doing it in time, but, people are out there, they are doing innovative and progressive and important things that are bringing down emissions and addressing social injustices of one sort or another. So let's learn from it and act on it.
Yeah, so we'll Google Rapid Transition Alliance, and we'll find. That's brilliant. That's very, very helpful. Peter, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. It's been great.
Humanistically Speaking is a volunteer-run online publication slotting in the gap between National Humanist glossy magazines and Humanist UK's newsletter. We aim to create a platform that can bring humanist groups and individual humanists together, of course, but also to allow non-humanists to join in the debate. We want to explore topics of interest that any free thinker will be concerned about and offer informative, factual articles that encourage people to reflect upon, explore, question and share ideas. We are in an exciting marketplace of ideas, and it is important that humanists from all stables of opinion have a voice. Humanistically Speaking is unique in offering this. Our remit is constantly developing, and by the start of our second year, we grew from a bi-monthly to a regular monthly issue. We've also expanded from email communication only to launching our own website and created our first values publication, From Atheism to Humanism. All of this has been made possible through your donations and your goodwill, and we're deeply grateful to those supporters among you who have donated already. But this is just the beginning. Our aim is a bold one. In addition to offering our support to National Secular Society and Humanists UK's campaign objectives, we want to share the humanist idea with everyone in society. Naturally, we want to celebrate rational thinking, open inquiry, compassion, fairness and justice, but we want to balance these good things with enjoyment and having fun, a sense of comradeship and the thrill of just being alive. But to go further, we need financial security, and we're asking you to help us. If you approve of what we're doing, please join us on our journey towards the foundation of a national humanist magazine that lends voice to every rational and respectful opinion. We want to explain and celebrate what humanism is and share humanist ideas that we believe can do so much to improve the way we all live. You can help us to achieve these aims by setting up a standing order of £4 a month or whatever you can afford to Humanistically Speaking, or if you're not able to do that, think about giving us a kickstart boost by donating a one-off lump sum of perhaps £20. Our bank details are at the bottom of this screen, but if you prefer, please click on the link below that will take you straight to the appropriate place on our Humanistically Speaking website and follow the guidance given. Every donation will be acknowledged with a message of thanks from us. One last thing before you go, do spread the word with your friends, because Humanistically Speaking is there for everyone. There are also many potential humanists out there who already share our values and yet don't know we exist. There are also humanists who don't have a group nearby and who might be feeling like a lone voice in their communities. We would like to serve them also and play our part in breaking down any sense of isolation. We're doing all we can by committing our time and energy. Please help us with your goodwill and donations and join us on this journey. Thank you.